What's up, guys? It's me, Jeremy. So recently, today actually, there was an announcement by the one and only Riot Meddler on the official League of Legends forums that was actually pretty interesting to me, and could potentially also have some pretty serious effects on the game in the future. And this announcement essentially confirms, at least in my eyes, that League of Legends draft and ranked modes will almost for sure, pretty much for sure, get 10 bans in the upcoming future later on in Season 7. You know, there was a lot of talk about it early on, a while back, but now we finally have something that I believe is pretty much an official confirmation, honestly. And there's a lot of really interesting implications that this has, and potential causes and effects that this might create in the future. And if you guys enjoyed the video, definitely hit that like button, or you know what, feel free to hit that dislike too. And if this video hits, let's say 4,000 ratings, I'm gonna buy myself a pizza to celebrate. Let's begin. So in the official post in question, Riot Meddler talked about how they are trying super hard to make 10 bans work, and that it's extremely likely that they're going to switch to a 10 ban system in the future. He also cited that they are going to wait for the new client to make the changes, but that client is probably coming in the preseason, so as for the timing of this actual change, it's probably going to be pretty soon actually, might be in like a month or so. He also mentioned that it might be the case where pro play receives the change at a different time, potentially at maybe an earlier even, or maybe later time than the rest of us, since it is a bit of a different dynamic with pro play compared to solo queue when it comes to actually increasing the bans. So although based on this quote, it is true that it's not 100% absolutely confirmed, but trust me on this, I definitely do speak from experience. When Riot is this public about changes like this, you know, 99% of the time they just straight up actually end up making it into the game. And if it wasn't something that was pretty much already guaranteed, then Riot Meddler honestly would have never brought it up in the first place. You know, Riot definitely avoids trying to talk about things that aren't almost a guaranteed thing, so I would be, you know, extremely surprised if this doesn't end up being implemented in some way, shape, or form in the future, and it's absolutely something that Riot is going to find a way to make work. But let's talk about that, you know, making it work. That is, at least, because there's definitely a lot more problems that increasing the bans in League of Legends has that you wouldn't necessarily see on paper. And it's also the biggest reason as well as to why this kind of change is essentially happening so late, you know? Why weren't the bans increased like 2 seasons ago? It's essentially this. Now, probably the biggest, or at least the most relevant issue with increasing the number of bans is the champion select time. You know, the time it takes to get through champion select. Right now, champion select on average is honestly pretty dang long, and Riot have been trying to make it faster and shorter ever since they launched the new version of it at the start of Season 6, really. And increasing the number of bans in theory would absolutely increase the time it takes to make it through champion select, which is actually a pretty lame downside, honestly. I don't know about you guys, but a lot of times when I play a champion select, man, it just feels long as hell, man. It's crazy. It's so long. However, Riot Meddler actually addressed this concern in his post as well, and said that they are going to be looking into ideas on how to avoid that, and that not increasing the champion select time is probably going to be pretty much a requirement for them increasing the number of bans, or at least like a really strong goal that they're aiming for. Another potential issue with increasing the number of bans actually is that it also increases the barrier to entry for new players, kind of, I guess. If you increase the bans, now you're just going to need a lot more champions to play ranked or draft mode, which is going to make it harder for those types of players to play in those game modes. However, increasing the barrier to entry for ranked in specific, draft mode not necessarily, but for ranked, increasing the barrier to entry isn't necessarily a bad thing, honestly, and if you consider the fact that Riot cut the amount of time it takes to actually get level 30 in the first place, they cut that pretty much in half in the middle of Season 6. So the limiting factor to first finally being able to queue up for ranked for a lot of new players actually really is that amount of champions needed to play the game mode, because in the time it takes to get level 30, you're not actually going to earn enough IP to buy the amount of champions that you need. So the only way you can play ranked the instant you hit level 30 is if you're spending RP on champions, or if you're just doing it specifically buying, you know, the absolute cheapest champions in the game. And since you need to own enough champions to still be able to pick one in that absurd scenario where you happen to be the last pick and every single champion you own gets banned or picked, increasing the amount of champions needed to play ranked is potentially a somewhat elegant solution, I guess, to increasing the actual barrier for ranked without actually also lengthening the leveling experience. With that said though, this is definitely a change focused on catering to the existing player base rather than one that is focused on affecting newer players. And as well, Riot Ghostcrawler has also gone on record and publicly said before that Riot cares more about catering to the existing player base than they care about catering to the potential new players, since they honestly just see the existing player base as being way larger than any potential new base of players, which honestly isn't necessarily the worst philosophy to have considering how ridiculously gigantic the League player base is already. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that increasing the barrier to entry for ranked, maybe for draft modes as well, while although that might hurt newer players, Riot honestly doesn't care all that much about newer players anyway, and it might actually maybe even be helpful rather than hurtful to that group of players anyway, so I'm honestly just going to completely throw out this counterpoint. So with that said, it definitely seems like this is going to be a pretty awesome change, honestly. You know, when League first increased the number of bans from 4 to 6, the original amount of bans was 4, when they increased it way back in the days of Season 1, League had around 60 champions or so at the time. Don't quote me on this since I'm kind of just going from my memory, honestly, but I believe it was around 63 champions at the time or so when they increased the number of bans. And since then, League has more than doubled the entire champion pool size, and today we have a whopping 133 champions released so far and counting. And in pro play, that honestly causes so many problems. There's so many strategies that just wreck teams because they can't afford to ban a certain champion. The small amount of bans in pro play really does limit a lot of the potential strategies or counter options just in general, and increasing the number of bans in pro play would honestly lead to just more diverse strategies and team compositions in general, because now teams need to be prepared for a lot more champions getting banned out. No more are we going to see like 3 junglers just totally dominate the scene, because then teams can actually afford to do things like ban out all 3 of those junglers and then pick some kind of crazy off meta thing. So when meta champions are limited more via bans, it's actually the case that in pro play at least, we're probably going to see a lot more off meta and maybe even more diverse picks being played. And honestly, there are just so many goddamn champions that it only makes sense to, at least for pro play. Now for solo queue, it's actually somewhat of a similar scenario. In solo queue, bans are usually just used to honestly just ban out the champions people think are overpowered. They're almost never really used for some sort of like actual strategy, so it kind of just becomes like this crutch that allows Riot to make more risky moves with their balancing, honestly, since if Riot messes up their balancing, people are just going to ban out the champion and it's fine, right? But if the amount of bans were increased, you'd actually be able to use your bans to actually ban out counter picks in solo queue a lot more reliably, rather than having to make sure that you just guarantee that you're banning out the 4 to 5 or so champions that seem to be dominating the scene and being flavor of the month at any given moment. And honestly, for that reason, it's something that I'm actually kind of excited about, and I think this is definitely going to be a pretty nice change, even for the solo queue players. It just honestly gives you more freedom and potentially more options and lets you do more things with your actual bans that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do, which is definitely pretty awesome. However, it does also create the problem of potentially limiting champions a bit too much as well. I mean, maybe you want to play some super awesome champion, but now they just get banned out constantly. Maybe that could be a potential downside for sure, but honestly, League has such a ridiculous amount of champions these days. I mean, sure, maybe that was a reasonable talking point when the amount of champions was like 70 and a vocal minority wanted more bans, but now that there are 133 champions and counting, this downside honestly becomes a lot less relevant just because there's so many champions. Now, as for how this will actually be implemented, Riot's definitely going to have to come up with a pretty clever solution to that big major problem of potentially increasing the time it takes to get through Champion Select in the first place. Now, Riot Meddler commented a bit on this idea, saying that one variant that they talked about, that they're kind of testing, is a version where all 10 players in the game simultaneously ban one champion each. And in that version, you would be able to see the champions your team is preemptively banning, but not the champions that your opponents are banning. And he went on to acknowledge that, yeah, this would pretty much completely deny players the ability to reactively ban things in response to bans from the opponent, but it would definitely save a ton of time from Champion Select. Now, this potential version of the idea is one that I'm seeing as actually being pretty problematic, actually. I mean, what happens if you ban the same champion as an opponent? There's all sorts of problems that this kind of system would implement, and honestly, losing the ability to reactively ban champions would actually take a lot away from what makes bans so awesome in the first place, especially for pro players. So although they're testing and experimenting with this version of it, I really hope that's not what they decide to go for actually, and that implementation could honestly potentially introduce a lot more problems than it actually solves. So what could you do instead? Well, perhaps you could do a mix of that idea and kind of the system we have now, so instead of banning all 5 champions together, you just ban like in groups almost. So, blue team bans 3 champions, then red team bans 3 champions or something, and then blue bans 2, and then red bans 2. Something like that is probably the most immediate idea that could maybe work, but something similar to that could potentially introduce problems of maybe giving too much of an advantage to red or blue side, depending on how it was implemented. It could be pretty lopsided, to be honest. It's definitely a bit tricky to implement, and I can't say for sure what the best way to do it is. Maybe you just give players less time to ban in general and, allow the players to prep their bans, kind of like how you can with champion picks. Maybe that might be a decent way to reduce the time it takes. It's definitely tough to say for sure, but there's quite a few variations that you can mess around with to try and figure it out. Anyway, though, we're just going to have to wait and see how this kind of change plays out in the future, I guess. Maybe you guys have some ideas on how to implement this sort of system. I'd definitely love to hear from you guys in the comment section below. Either way, though, looks like that's going to be it for me. If you guys enjoyed the video, definitely hit that like button. And thanks for making it all the way to the end. Feel free to subscribe if you want. And as always, I'll see you guys next time.